welcome to the Two Beans in a Pod. Today we are immersing ourselves in the, let's say, provocative intellectual landscape created by Thiel's recent closed-door lectures in San Francisco, specifically his really intense focus on the concept of the Antichrist, fusing theology, technology, and contemporary politics. These lectures, they really compel us to ask a critical question. Is Thiel's use of this, eschatological concept a credible, deep-seated theological and political warning against a defined existential risk? Or is this framework primarily a rhetorical strategy, a kind of sophisticated political theology, really designed to rationalize a radical anti-regulatory and pro-capital agenda? I tend to hold the former position, arguing that Thiel's framework provides a crucial, maybe heterodox, but crucial warning against the existential risk of a totalitarian, one-world state achieved through institutional fear and, regulatory control.
Yeah, I come at it from a different way. While I certainly acknowledge the intellectual force Thiel brings to his arguments, I find this entire theological construct to be fundamentally instrumental. It acts as an eccentric, maybe self-serving mechanism designed to delegitimize essential public oversight and really to advance a very specific anti-democratic political project, one focused on preserving unchecked power and, let's call it, technological freedom. For me, this isn't a sincere warning. It feels much more like political marketing cloaked in religious allegory.
Well, Thiel is quite explicit about his philosophical starting point. He identifies as a small o Orthodox Christian and a humble classical liberal. And he claims, interestingly, that his concern about the Antichrist is his only real deviation from classical liberal orthodoxy. So that immediately signals, the importance of the concept to his worldview. His definition is crucial because he views the Antichrist not really as a literal villain, but as a systemic societal threat. The primary danger, in his estimation, is the one-world totalitarian state, or one-worldism, a sort of homogenized system that promises peace and safety, and he references 1 Thessalonians 5:3 there, but which leads, he argues, inexorably to permanent stagnation and the total suppression of genuine human freedom and dynamism. He pushes back quite hard on the caricature of the evil scientist, arguing that in the 21st century, the Antichrist is not some Dr. Strangelove figure, but rather a Luddite who wants to stop all science.
Right, but the problem I see is that the identity of this Luddite constantly shifts, doesn't it? It seems to shift based on whatever inconveniences him politically or economically at the moment. This Antichrist framework, it really serves as a kind of meme or a cipher, as some have put it, for anything that might constrain his power or the power of his capital. You see, by casting essential public oversight, the foundational task of any responsible modern state, as cosmic persecution, he creates a very convenient foil. So, for example, he characterizes the FDA, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or climate policy advocates, including figures like Greta Thunberg, and even AI safety proponents like Eliezer Yudkowsky, as these legionnaires of the Antichrist. This framing suggests that the global reach of U.S. regulatory standards, because other countries often just defer to them, is what accelerates this one-worldism. But, this leads to a really profound tension, maybe even hypocrisy. Thiel co-founded Palantir, right? A company named after the all-seeing totalitarian orb in Lord of the Rings. Critics, including people like Ross Douthat, rightly point out that Palantir provides the very surveillance and data consolidation technology required for the exact kind of totalitarian one-world state he claims to be warning against. And frankly, his substantial political spending on deregulation and disruption, it speaks louder than his eschatological fears, in my view.
Okay, I see why you emphasize the tension in his political behavior. That's fair. But I think you might be misidentifying the primary risk he is attempting to warn against. Thiel maintains that stagnation itself, the lack of progress, is the foundational existential risk.
His argument is that when progress halts, humans compete, often violently, over limited resources, which increases conflict. So his concern about AI, therefore, isn't primarily about the immediate, catastrophic risk, Armageddon scenarios, but about choosing progress, even risky progress, over what he calls total stagnation. He uses the example of technological failure in areas like medical research, noting that, in his view, we've made zero progress in 40 to 50 years on diseases like Alzheimer's.
This is evidence to him that institutional failure, risk aversion, and regulatory barriers are the true obstacles. It suggests that something is deeply wrong with our society, hindering necessary breakthroughs. So if AI is the only vector for significant growth in the near term, even if it only adds, say, 1% to GDP annually, like the late 90s internet maybe, we must accept its risks because the alternative, he fears, is this deep institutional rot.
Well, I appreciate the argument that institutional rot is a genuine problem. I certainly wouldn't deny that. But I have to push back on the framing of stagnation as the primary existential threat we need to grapple with right now. Thiel's obsession with stagnation feels like a calculated distraction, perhaps, from the catastrophic risks of the unbridled regressive progress he champions. Think about the dynamics of totalitarian control. Historical totalitarianism, say in the 20th century, often failed because of a fundamental knowledge problem. The state simply couldn't process enough data fast enough to maintain perfect control. Now, to achieve the kind of permanent, stagnant authoritarianism Thiel warns against, you first need a massive, transformative burst of technological progress. Specifically, things like pervasive AI and the kind of surveillance systems Palantir sells. Systems that make total, comprehensive control technically plausible for the first time. You see, the fear of catastrophe, whether it's climate change or runaway AI, is exactly what inspires people to seek the peace and safety that the Antichrist figure promises in the scripture he cites. So by aggressively championing the very technological breakthrough that enables perfect surveillance and perfect control, Thiel is kind of ironically cheering on the necessary technical prerequisites for the Antichrist state he claims to fear. It seems like he's mistaken the symptom for the cure. Progress, when leveraged by unchecked power, becomes the ultimate tool of conformity, not freedom.
That's a compelling point regarding the technological enablers. I'll grant you that. But I would argue that Thiel's concern cuts deeper than just the hardware or the processing power. The core issue, as he frames it anyway, isn't technology itself, but whether that technology is, in his words, woke or conformist. He's actually quite skeptical of the idea of a purely unstoppable superintelligence cascade because he believes the gating factor isn't raw IQ. I mean, society has always had smart people, but the cultural ability to break deeply stuck problems like curing dementia, as we mentioned. So if AI is just conventionally smart, if it conforms to the risk-averse, politically correct, bureaucratic norms that he sees paralyzing Western institutions, then it won't achieve the necessary breakthroughs.
Progress, in his view, requires genuine, radical heterodoxy and a willingness to accept far more risk, precisely what the regulatory, peace, and safetyism culture actively prohibits. So the fight for him is for technological dynamism that resists conformity, not really against the technology itself.
It seems we've definitely established a clear tension here between the perceived necessity of progress and the existential risks inherent in its acceleration.
Indeed. And it really underscores the complexity of this whole debate, forcing us to rigorously examine the motivations and the logic informing these, frankly, high-stakes decisions. We encourage our listeners who appreciate this kind of rigorous exchange of ideas to hit the like button and subscribe to Two Beans in a Pod to ensure they don't miss future episodes where we tackle complex topics like this.
Okay, so turning now to what I see as the heart of the critique, the political instrumentalization of eschatology. Thiel isn't, I'd argue, primarily interested in classical theological doctrine for its own sake, but rather for its political utility in clearly delineating friends and enemies. He famously quotes the, let's say, controversial Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, arguing the high points of politics are when the enemy is, in concrete clarity, recognized as the enemy. He uses this Antichrist concept, it seems, to construct a simplified, almost Manichaean worldview where his opponents, liberals, globalists, regulators, anyone pushing for safety and conformity, are cast as forces of evil or chaos. And this Manichaean lens then justifies his highly disruptive political actions, such as, bankrolling radical candidates like Donald Trump, whom he apparently views as necessary agents to break that institutional inertia.
Well, I'm not convinced that using the theological or historical frameworks to define political enemies automatically makes the framework insincere or merely instrumental. I mean, every major political philosophy requires some fundamental other or tension to define itself against, doesn't it? Thiel's specific use of concepts like the Kachon is really essential here. The Kachon, for listeners maybe unfamiliar, is that classical concept of the restrainer, the force holding back the Antichrist until the proper time. Thiel views the U.S., somewhat paradoxically, as being the natural candidate for Kachon and Antichrist. Simultaneously, ground zero of the one-world state through its global regulatory influence, and also ground zero of the resistance to it. Now that strikes me as far more profound than just political score settling. It suggests a high philosophical understanding of the struggle, that the tension between total order and, let's say, necessary chaos is real and maybe intrinsic to American freedom. Furthermore, Thiel argues that if something is not powerful enough to potentially become the Antichrist, it probably isn't that good as a catechon. That raises the stakes dramatically, doesn't it? It places the question of human agency and the outcome of the struggle for liberty firmly back on the table, rather than just dismissing the US as, merely a failed empire or something simplistic like that.
The problem with the catechon concept, though, as Thiel deploys it, is its selective and, frankly, idiosyncratic nature. This supposed small o Orthodox Christian rejects the traditional biblical understanding of death as a natural endpoint, reframing it as evil to be technologically defeated. He seems to be striving for immortality, seeking to bring heaven to earth via machines. This highly customized theology, especially when you view it alongside his investment in surveillance technology that we talked about, it suggests less an adherence to orthodox belief and more a convenient vehicle, perhaps, for advancing his preferred right-wing political revival. A revival that arguably seeks the privileges of empire without the duties of citizenship. And furthermore, the adversary is just too fluid to be taken as a serious, consistent theological threat. He shifts from declaring radical Islam the providential enemy of the West maybe 2 decades ago, then pivots to seize totalitarian China, and now finally he's naming environmentalists like Greta Thunberg. This fluidity strongly suggests that the function of maintaining a state of Manichaean conflict, the justification for radical anti-establishment intervention, is far more important to him than the specific identity of the adversary. It allows him to attack any check or balance, really, from the FDA to environmental protections, anything that might limit his concentrated wealth and power.
But this shifting enemy, you could argue, is simply the evolving manifestation of a single, consistent structural threat. Those forces driving toward one-worldism, or global conformity. Whether that conformity is driven by, say, Islamic fundamentalism in one era, or the bureaucratic standards of global regulation in another, or maybe the centralized control of a high-tech Chinese state. The underlying danger he sees is the erasure of difference and the elimination of the possibility of progress through radical action. Thiel views this dynamic struggle, perhaps informed by intellectual traditions like René Girard's theory of mimetic rivalry, as the core reality of politics. So he's using a powerful allegory, yes, but maybe to call attention to a genuine structural pressure toward global bureaucratic stagnation.
So in summarizing my position, Thiel's Antichrist concept, regardless of how one assesses his theological alignment or his corporate activities, functions as a serious, compelling call to action. We must, he urges, recognize that the greatest threat to human flourishing might come not from an obvious aggressive villain, but from the very systems designed to ensure safety and peace, but at the cost of dynamism and freedom, thereby accelerating stagnation and perhaps a kind of spiritual death.
And my position remains firm. This Antichrist framework serves primarily as a sophisticated political theology. It instrumentalizes ancient, potent narratives to justify radical, anti-regulatory positions and the accumulation of wealth without sufficient accountability. It stands, I think, as a cautionary example of how great wealth and power can amplify and popularize seemingly eccentric intellectual frameworks, compelling us all to rigorously examine the, let's say, potentially self-serving motivations behind such profound-sounding pronouncements.
Ultimately, the material really requires readers, or listeners in our case, to decide whether they fear the Antichrist of total stagnation, the Luddite who seeks to halt all progress, or perhaps the Antichrist enabled by unchecked technological power and the accumulation of vast, unaccountable capital.
And perhaps whether a self-professed classical liberal who actively seeks to dismantle democratic checks and balances can truly be trusted as the purveyor of genuine warnings about tyranny.
Thank you for listening to this rigorous exchange.
Yes, and if you found this discussion illuminating, please do hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for listening to Two Beans in a Pod. If you are interested in the book, please order it from the link below.